Wake up, people, wake up. Wake up. Wake up, people, wake up now. Wake up. Wake up, people, wake up. Wake up. Wake up the people, Lord, wake up. Wake up. Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people find their way. Better days are coming by and by. We can make it if we try. Come on. Wake up the people, Lord. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up, people. Wake up now. Wake up. Wake up the people, Lord. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up, people. Wake up now.
Yes, good afternoon, family. Good afternoon. This is Brother Jegna bringing you another Afrocentricity Bookman show. Every Sunday, please tell your friends, 4 to 6 p.m. every Sunday, the Afrocentricity Book Show, Bookman Show, where we look at the best books, the best lectures, the best essays, all from the perspective of African people. This is the only way we can really see the world, we can understand reality, is by analyzing the world for ourselves through our own eyes. What are we reading at the moment? Last week we started the new book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery by Naim Akbar. It's really an excellent book, so we've made a little headway. We're on page 14 now, so we'll continue shortly. I must remind you that this show is sponsored by Glass Are Us. You can get Glass Are Us at 7307 Sisters Road, London N15 5NH. That is 7307 Sisters Road, N15 5NH. You can get Glass Are Us on the telephone number of 0208 800 6663. That's 0208 800 6663. So please go to Glass Are Us for all of your glazing needs. So double glazing repairs, putty glass repairs, mirrors, tabletop, shelving, splashbacks, mirrors, you name it. Please go to Glass Are Us. You'll get a 10% discount if you mention the Afrocentricity Bookman Show. I must always remind you as well, it's only 10 days to go now. There is a showing of the excellent film Birth of a Nation, made by Nate Parker, who wrote, directed and starred in it. And it is happening on the Wednesday, the 31st of July, 2019, at 7 p.m. till 10 p.m. That is Wednesday, the 31st of July, so it's 10 days to go. We are showing The Birth of a Nation at the Maat Centre, 366A High Road, Tottenham, London N17 9HT. That is Birth of a Nation, Wednesday the 31st of July 2019, from 7 till 10 p.m. This is at the Maat Centre, 366A High Road, Tottenham, London N17 9HT. So you can buy your tickets online. Just go to Just Tickets, that's JUS hyphen tickets, Just Tickets, and put in Birth of a Nation, and you can get your tickets there. You get the best price by going online and buying your ticket online. So it's going to be a really great showing. There will be a discussion at the end, and also there's free food and free refreshments on the night as well. So coming back to where we are reading the Breaking the Psychological Chains of Slavery by Naim Akbar. I must say, I had a quick little conversation earlier today online on social media with Lady Leo. I hope you guys all tune into our community show every Friday evening, community information show from Lady Leo. But just a little small talk on social media. And there's a video going around about our children are being groomed. They're being groomed by people who want to sell drugs, get our children, young children, to sell drugs. So if young children haven't got, as you know, many of the youth clubs are closed down, they haven't got nowhere to go. People are deliberately targeting them to groom them. So we need to keep an eye on that. But what Lady Leo actually said was, our children are groomed in another way as soon as they go to school. Because as you know, the first school for our children is at home. Our mothers, our fathers at home. This is really the first school. The first teachers are our parents. But as soon as our children go out into the outside world, they begin to get groomed in the schools. Infant school, junior high school. So what do we mean by that? They're groomed away from their culture. Our culture is African culture, and we teach our children our own values, our own culture within the house. But as we go into school, unfortunately, schools, because they've got obviously a Eurocentric curriculum, they are groomed to be non-African. They are groomed to see the world through European eyes. And as you know, Europeans generally dislike African people. Not because I believe that, but I look at history. I look at their institutions. The only way you can judge a people is by judging their institutions and see what institutions they would do or how they act, how they behave in relation to us. Because you cannot believe what people say, because people say many things. But their institutions, their actions really show you, yeah, I think you all know the saying, actions speak louder than words. So there is a grooming. So because Europeans generally dislike black people, then if our children are groomed there, they begin to dislike themselves. We could say they're groomed into self-hatred, a low self-esteem. So these are things we need to focus on and keep an eye on. And partly this book kind of goes towards that kind of understanding of how not all people have the same culture. There is popular culture, which everybody goes to. You know, we go to theatre, we go to the restaurants, we go to the cinema. But then there's specific culture, national culture, or religious culture. And European culture is their culture, which is natural. But we are not Europeans. So if we adopt their culture, we adopt their norms, and some of their norms is not good for us, not good for us at all. Because we're African people, we should not follow another people. Europeans don't follow Chinese culture. Chinese culture don't follow Indian culture. As African people, we shouldn't follow a foreign culture to us. It's very important that we educate our children into our own culture, our mores, our more ways, and our values, and in relation to our own interests. It's very important we educate our children in line with that. So anyway, coming back to the book we got at hand, we are reading Nine Akbar's excellent book. And I've just lost my page, so give me a moment. We're going back to the Nine Akbar's excellent book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. So the general idea of the book is that during enslavement, there's certain behaviors we picked up. We had to adapt to these abnormal conditions. And the abnormal conditions were that we had to maybe act the fool to survive. We had to do many different things to survive, which was natural. However, the thing is, after our enslavement, we weren't given, we wasn't kind of deprogrammed. What happened to us? Yeah, we didn't, people sit down and say, whoa, there's a long, many years of slavery, 300-400 years, even 500 years. These are things you picked up. You need to get rid of them from your behaviors, from your psyche. Yeah. So unfortunately, because we wasn't sat down and talked about this, many of these negative behaviors we still hold within ourselves and pass on to our children. And this is what this book is about. So I'm gonna go over now. This is page 14, and this is personal inferiority I'm talking about now, which was pumped into us, because the only way that people can rule any other people they want to dominate, they can do it by force, but force alone is not going to keep it going. They have to do it psychologically. So maybe the people believe that they should be enslaved, they should be dominated. So, heading personal inferiority. Let us consider another one of the most destructive characteristics from slavery. This characteristic is a sense of our inferiority as African people. This characteristic has been discussed by psychologists more than any other. It has been used as an explanation for nearly every aspect of African and African American behavior. The self-hatred or low self-esteem of African people has certainly been overworked, but is worthy of our consideration in this discussion. The shrewd slave makers were fully aware that people who still respected themselves as human beings would resist to the death the dehumanizing process of slavery. Therefore, a systematic process of creating a sense of inferiority in the proud African was necessary in order to maintain them as slaves. This was done by humiliating and dehumanizing acts, such as public beatings, parading them on slave blocks, unclothed, inspecting them as though they were cattle or horses. They were forbidden to communicate with other slaved. They would have been a basis for maintaining self-respect. Many historians and slave narratives report how young children were separated from their mothers because the mother's love might cultivate some self-respect in the child. Cleanliness, personal effectiveness are fairly essential in the maintenance of self-respect. Slaves were kept filthy, and the very nature of physical restraints over a long period of time began to develop in the people a sense of helplessness. The loss of the ability to even clean one's body and to shield oneself from blows began to teach the slaves, or rather the enslaved, that they should not have no respect. They should have no self-respect. These things combined with the insults, the loss of cultural traditions, which is very important as well, rituals, family life, religion, and even names will serve to cement the loss of self-respect. As the slave master exalted himself and enforced respect of himself, he was increasingly viewed as superior to the slaved. This superiority was based on the utter dehumanization of the Africans. The slaves were forced to bow and bend to the slave owner and treat him as God. With the image of a Caucasian man even as God, and with all kinds of images of Africans as dirty and only half human, it was inevitable that a sense of inferiority would grow into the African American and the African personality. Carter G. Woodson, a great scholar, said in 1931, to handicap a student for life by teaching him that he has a black face, or that his black face is a curse, and that his struggle to change conditions is hopeless, is the worst kind of lynching. It kills one's aspirations and dooms one to vagabondage and crime. So you can see he says that a person who's handicapped by being taught that his black face is a cause, his black skin is a curse, and he cannot change any action to change their conditions are hopeless. He says it's the worst kind of lynching, because when you do that to the human psyche, it kills one's aspirations and dooms them to vagabondage and crime. So this sense of inferiority still affects us in many ways. Our inability to respect African leadership, our persistent and futile efforts to look like and act like Caucasian people is based upon this sense of inferiority. The persistent tendency to think of dark skin as unattractive, kinky hair as bad hair, and African features as less appealing than Caucasian features come from this sense of inferiority. Our lack of respect for African expertise and the irresponsibility of many African experts comes from this sense of inferiority. The disastrously high black-on-black homicide rate is in many ways indicative of fundamental disrespect for black life growing out of this sense of inferiority. It is a simple fact that people who love themselves seek to preserve their lives, not to destroy them. The fact that we remain as consumers and laborers rather than manufacturers, planners and managers has a lot to do with this sense of inferiority. The continued portrayal in the media of Africans as clowns, servants, crooks, and incompetents maintain this sense of inferiority. So let me just say, this book was written maybe 30 odd years ago, and it speaks about then our portrayal in the media as clowns, servants, and crooks, and incompetents. Do you see the difference from the press today? So we can see our cousins on the other side of the Atlantic are under the same treatment from the same Europeans, same European media. We could be speaking about today, but you're speaking about 30 or plus years ago. So you can see things haven't changed. It's very, very important that we understand that these people are the same people, and we understand that we are the same people as well. This is a continuation of the slavery patterns. Only those persons who looked like, acted like, and thought in a frame of reference of the master were completely acceptable. Those earning such acceptance were projected as far superior to those who looked like or acted like and thought in the frame of reference of Africans' self-affirmation. So it's very important we understand the concept of self-affirmation and frames of reference. I think I said last week, a frame of reference is like a reference book we have in our minds. So anytime you want to go to something, if you want to know about music, you go for your mind and you know that, well, African people created music. If you want to know about mathematics, your frame of reference will be, oh, African people created mathematics. There's a papyrus in the British Museum called the Armes papyrus, and you can see that sophisticated mathematics that our ancestors were working out the calculations of the angles of pyramids and the volumes of pyramids. Very sophisticated mathematics. 1500 years ago, remember, Europeans hadn't written yet. Their first person to read and to write was Homer, and he wrote about 800 BC. And this Armes mathematical papyrus is 1500 BC at least. And obviously to be right it then, they must have been centuries and centuries, if not thousands of years prior to that. Because we knew they built the pyramids in the Old Kingdom. They had this type of knowledge. So our frame of reference must be our own frame of reference. Because if we have a European frame of reference, if we want to know about mathematics, we're going to think, oh, the Greeks maybe started mathematics. Or if you want to know about medicine, oh, maybe the father of medicine might be found in Greece. But this is actually falsehood because our frame of reference have been knocked out of our heads, unfortunately, and we've been given a false frame of reference. So Afrocentricity is a concept of seeing the world, having our own frame of reference. So when we think about things, we know our involvement. Oftentimes we know that our creation of many of these sciences that rule the world today. So we can reverse the destructive effects of slavery by looking to our strengths in the past and beginning to make plans for our future. So never think of the past as only the past. Our past is linked to our present and is definitely linked to our present. Because what we know how we have done in the past, we know that we can do in the future. There is no doubt. If we begin to direct our children's attention to strong images, like themselves, they will grow in self-respect. We must honor and exalt our own heroes, and those heroes must be people who have done the most to dignify us as a people. We must seek to overcome the plantation ghost by identifying the forces which lead to enslavement and self-abasement. I interrupt here, one obvious form of self-abasement is us calling ourselves the N-word. Why would we use the worst word that people have to hate us and throw at us? We use it to describe each other. I'm sure you'll know which N-word I'm talking about. So because they was told it, call it so many times, Malcolm X said, he was called it so much times as a youngster, he thought it was his name. So it's obviously psychological damage is the reason why they call it themselves, but they continue to call themselves. So we should never call ourselves as things. When we call ourselves, we must call ourselves the highest, the greatest, the best things, not things that debase us, ever. If we want to free ourselves from our conditions, we need to only use language which is liberating language. And this, again, this is a concept of Afrocentricity. We must honor and exalt our own heroes, and those heroes must be people who have done the most to dignify us as a people. We must seek to overcome the plantation ghost by identifying the forces which lead to enslavement and abasement and self-abasement. We must definitely avoid the psychologically disruptive representations of God in a Caucasian form. And this will be discussed later in this chapter, or later in a later chapter. We must build and maintain strong, clean and safe communities. The abilities to influence our environment in some small ways are first steps towards building and restoring self-respect. So we can see how necessary this book is, because what we see happening in our streets now with some of our youngsters, if we had been taught this book from an early age and teach our children this information, some of the problems, not all, because life is too simple to say all, but some of the problems that we face in our community we'll be able to take care of much easier because we would have had the knowledge. So this heading here is called Community Division. The point of this discussion is that slavery had and continues to have a devastating effect on the personalities of African people. There is much overlap and connection between these traits since we have all come out of the same situation. There is also a wide variation as to the continued influence of these traits on different individuals, but certainly they persist to a lesser or greater extent within ourselves and within our community. One of the most serious disturbances of community advancement comes from the slavery experience of disunity or community division. The age-old pattern of divide and conquer was utilized along with many other tricks in order to destroy African community life. And let me say that this is not only for us in slavery. Speaking to many Africans from the continent and reading books about this as well, they've had this same dominated mind as well, this low self-esteem. So even with this book about psychological slaves or chains of slavery, our Africans who were colonized by Europeans had the same treatment. Again, that's the only way they could rule them. So these words I'm saying is not only to the former enslaved, but also for the former colonized, because it's the same treatment they used against us so they could dominate us and dominate and destroy us much easier. The slave makers were fully aware of that a disunited community would be easy prey for the continued control by the master. Therefore, all kinds of devices were utilized in order to make sure that the slaves would not be able to come together. A speech delivered by a white slave trainer called Willie Lynch on the banks of the James River in 1712 well illustrates this strategy. So this is the Willie Lynch, some people call it Willie Lynch syndrome, the Willie Lynch letter. This is from the words of Willie Lynch. And I'll tell you something about Willie Lynch once I finish reading this, okay? And this is allegedly what he said to the slave masters. I'm bringing you a bag of tricks so you can rule your slaves maybe for 1,000 years. He said, I have outlined a number of differences among the slaves, and I take these differences and make them bigger. I use fear, distrust, and envy for control purposes. Take this simple list of differences and think about them. On the top of my list is age. It is only there because it begins with A. The second is color or shade. Then there is intelligence, size, sex, size of plantation, status on plantations, attitudes of owners, whether the slaves live in the valley or on the hill, east, west, north or south, have fine or coarse hair, is tall or short. Now that you have a list of differences, I shall give you an outline of action. You must pitch the old black against the young black. You must use the dark-skinned slaves against the light-skinned slaves, and the light-skinned slaves against the dark-skinned. You must also have your white servants and overseers distrust all blacks. But it is necessary that your slaves trust and depend on us. They must love and respect and trust only us. So I think you can see what's happening there. Gentlemen, these kits are your keys to control them. Use them. Have your wives and children use them. Never miss an opportunity. My plan is guaranteed. And the good thing is that if used intensely for 1 year, the slaves themselves will remain perpetually distrustful. So I'm sure you all, or many of you, because some will not know, but I'm sure all of you are used to this, Willie Lynch. That film called The Great Debaters, starring, his name will come to me, so the great actor, he mentioned in that film, The Great Debaters, the Willie Lynch story, yeah? Denzel Washington, yeah? Acting in that film called The Great Debates, or The Great Debaters, he actually mentioned the Willie Lynch thing. So let me say to you, you can see exactly what's said in that letter, or that speech by Willie Lynch is true. You can see that, and you know that. However, Willie Lynch's letter is not a real letter, or a speech. This African-American doctor, professor, who actually created this concept of Willie Lynch, and it's been proven now in the USA. So he's kind of created as a learning kind of document, a teaching document, for us to understand what happened to us. But Willie Lynch was not a real person. People have searched high and wide to find, and there was no such Willie Lynch who went to the USA. He's supposed to come from the Caribbean to teach the slaves how to enslave. But it's been proven that it's a professor, I can't remember his name now. If I forget the name, I'll read it out at a later show. But nevertheless, we can see that what was said is truthful. light skin against the dark skin, the old against the young, him up the hill against him in the gully. Any difference, male, female, any difference, use it and make it more and more and more. Let me also tell you that divide and conquer was not created by Europeans, it was created by Africans. The ancient Egyptians of the Nile Valley used this because they had the first empire, world empire, and these are the tricks they used to divide and conquer. So these tricks comes out of our own toolkit, okay? However, social divisions were put into our minds so they could control us and dominate us. These people were terrified of us. They went to sleep with their gun. They went to church with a gun on as well because they were scared that we was going to overthrow them at any time. They were terrified. However, with a gun, they have power. You can see USA today. They think they could be. You can see that devil's in the White House. The way he talks, because he's got all the arms in the world. That's the way they talk. But it doesn't mean they can't be defeated. Because if they could be defeated, we'd be still being slaves now. The Haitian Revolution, our ancestors destroyed the French, the British, and the Spanish, the greatest superpowers of the age. And these are people who just came out of enslavement. So there's nothing that can be beaten, or cannot be beaten. We must remember that. Never be scared, otherwise we'll just crouch down in the corner. You must just stay at home, not even get out of bed. We can defeat anybody, because we've proven it, and we can do it in the future. And not that we can, we're going to, because there's no two ways about it. Do we want our children and grandchildren to be living as we're living now, and our great-grandchildren? That's why we have to do something about it. There were major social divisions constructed by the master. The house workers and the field workers constituted the major separation among the slaves. Those slaves with the lesser physical load of the housework were taught by the master to see themselves as a privileged group. So, as you know, Malcolm X spoke about the house nigger, or the house negro, and the field negro. Let me just remind you, this is Brother Jegner. This is the Afrocentricity Bookman Show. We are reading Breaking the Psychological Chains of Enslavement by Dr. Naim Akbar. They were permitted, this is the house Negroes, were permitted to wear better clothes, eat slightly better foods, and most importantly, they were permitted to take care of the personal needs of the master and his household. Just to be physically close to his master gave the slave a sense of superiority over his fellow slaves. Stamp, our author in 1956, describes this phenomenon in the following way. The slaveholder needed the willing cooperation of some of his bondsmen to make his government work efficiently. Knowing that the majority could not be trusted, he tried to recruit a few who would be loyal to him and take his side against the others. Usually he found his allies among the domestics, skilled artisans and foremen, all whom he encouraged to feel superior and to remain separate from the field hands. In this manner, some planters gained the assistance of the chattels, who identified themselves wholly with the master class. So again, another way of division, another way of disunity. And remember, we wasn't sit down after our enslavement and counsel. We didn't get counselling. We didn't have people saying, "Oh, this is what happened to you. Never mind, come out of it." So many of these things, which we thought was just normal behaviour, are adaptations for this disastrous, terrible ma'afa situation we was in. We adopt it into our psyche and pass it on to our children. There is a scientist said very recently that people pass on in their genes these things. They said that the European Jews, their Holocaust, it says that they passed on certain behaviors to their children through their genes. And that was, remember, the European Holocaust was something like an 8-year period. They lost 6 million people. Well, think about 500 years, using maybe 500 million people. What do you think the effect of that was? I'll continue. The slaves who were the illegitimate offspring of the master were usually given greater privileges. Along with other house slaves, they were delegated authority over the field hands of the master. The tradition grew up, giving those slaves with their physical features like the master a feeling of superiority over those slaves without such features. Again, Stamp observes, but the most piteous device for seeking status in the slave community was that boasting about the white ancestors or taking pride in the light complexion. In the eyes of the whites, the mulatto was tainted as much as the pure Negro, and as hopelessly tied to the inferiority class. However, that did not prevent some slaves of mixed ancestry, not all, from trying to make their Caucasian blood serve as a mark of superiority within their own class. So if you remember maybe a month or a couple of months ago now, remember we read the book by C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins? In Haiti, which the French dominate Haiti, the slave colony of Haiti, they divided the Africans into pure blacks, and then mixed race, and then quadroons and octroons. They had about 20 different splits. So each one could hate each other. The lighter skinned hate the slightly lighter skinned, and the lighter skin will hate the darker skin, and the darker skin will hate, yeah, so it's kind of crazy. They had about 20 different divisions of black people, of African people. All of them were inferior to European. However, they used that, again, as a system of domination, because the one of the lighter skin, who was closest to the oppressor, the slave master, was superior, and it kept him in a way to hate the pure black. And this is the way they made them. If you hated somebody, you're not going to unite with them. But obviously there were some of the highest colour who knew exactly who they were, and they hated the European, yeah, and they loved the black people. They loved their black ancestry, their African ancestry. But again, these are the tools that they use, and as we know, we pass it down today. We pass this down today. Among the house and field slaves, there was a constant designation and alternation of authority by the master in order to keep the community divided. Those given authority were made to believe that their welfare was dependent on the master's welfare, and that they were independent of their fellow slaves. Therefore, they worked against the development of any unity among the slaves, because they felt that, let me just say that, because they felt that they were linked to their master, any unity among the slaves, they'd lose their position. So they will fight against any unity to keep their position. You can see what they did. I mean, Malcolm X spoke about these slaves, and he made a joke about it. He says that if a slave master got sick, the house Negro would say, "What's wrong, master? We sick?" He wouldn't say you're sick, he said we sick, because he see himself so much, he identified himself so much with his master, he'd say, "We sick." And also Malcolm X said that if the master's house caught on fire, he says that the house slave, the house Negro, would try to fight the fire harder than the slave master would himself. But the field African, he didn't try to put out the flame. He prayed for wind, so the house would just burn to the ground. So you can see the two mindsets there. And sadly, those mindsets are there today. So this book will help us to understand what's going on and help us maybe to fight against these things. So again, this is Brother Jegna, and this is the Afrocentricity Bookman show. And we are reading Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery by Naim Akbar. So the slaves with certain skills, such as iron workers, blacksmiths or carpenters, were separated from the common field hands and made to believe that there was something quite special. All of these special categories of slaves were easily pitted against one another on the basis of their special classes or skills, which prevented them from dealing with their common status as a slave. Their total dependence on the slave holding essentially sealed their fate against their effective self-development. The inevitable conflict among them was almost invariably worked for the benefit of the slave master. The slaves' energies became consumed in affirming and defending their special class membership, rather than addressing their real problem, the conditions of slavery. The master fostered such rivalries since such false issues effectively distracted from the real issue. The real issue is to get out of slavery. The false issue is like who wants to be closer to the master. It seems that Willie Lynch's kit worked like a charm and is still effective almost 300 years later. Divided communities among Africans persist. The sophistication of the classes divided, the community has improved, and the classifications have multiplied tremendously. Rather than house versus field, it is fraternities, sororities, schools, churches, white collar, blue collar, Republican, Democrat, Labour, Conservative, neighbourhoods, and hundreds of other bases for divisions. How'd you know some of our youngsters? Postcodes. They'll fight each other over postcodes. So all these divisions are there, are put there, and no doubt are kept by. We have to think about when something's in place. Think of who it benefits. Does a postcode rivalry benefit the people fighting it? No. But who does it benefit? I'm sure you can work that out, okay? Always look who benefits from it. Or, as they say, follow the money if you want to know why certain phenomena, certain things are occurring. The root is simple, but the basis for separation is the same. That is to keep the community divided. The origin of all the classes, clubs, and groups still come from the same source, an outsider who still profits from our division. I hope you're listening to this. The root is simple, but the basis for separation is the same. That is to keep the community divided. The origin of all the classes, clubs, groups, religions, you name it, still come from the same source, an outsider who still profits from our division. Although perhaps not intentional, the divisive outcomes is the same. The deeply entrenched predisposition to accept division rather than unity within our communities is one of the most deadly outcomes of slavery. Every leader or scholar who has attempted to address the African American community problem, no doubt the same Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey in the Caribbean, had the same fight in his hand when Marcus Garvey went back to Jamaica to run for a political position. These are sort of rivalries that he had to fight there. It's no different no matter where you look. Every leader or scholar who has attempted to address this community problem poses this destructive disunity as the most deadly disease in our communities. On those fleeting occasions when African communities have unified behind an issue, our potency as a people has become awesome. So whenever we unite against the issue, we can do whatever we need to do. Because it says there, our potency is awesome. But people who fight against it, why are people fighting against it? Perhaps it is in the potential power of such unity which forces those who profit from it, the status quo, to feed the disunity among African people. One would hope that exposure to this plantation ghost, to the light of knowledge, would facilitate its rapid disappearance. Africans now, as we did 300 years ago, still spend more time justifying our separate goals than we do working on our shared goals. Let me just interrupt here. Are you familiar in the USA? They got a group called ADOS, African Descendants of Slaves. They're saying that we're not real Africans. We don't got nothing to do with Africa. We've got nothing to do with the people of the Caribbean, Brazil. Our group now is ADOS, African Descendants of Slaves. So they're using this craziness to divide us again. Who came up with this African Descendants of Slaves? What is the purpose of it? Clearly, the purpose is to divide us, disunity more and more. So you can see what Knight Akbar is speaking about in his book. We just continue it. ADOS. Who the hell wants to be a slave? So your origin is a slave. We are the greatest people on the planet. We are the first people on this planet. We created speech techniques. No one could speak before we could speak. No one mentioned a creator, a God, before we mentioned a creator. But we don't want to go back to who our roots are. We want to be, our origin is a slave. So this is where we are. So we can see how powerful these books are for us to understand what's going on with us, so we can combat it, so we can fight it, so we can reverse these evil trends which have been indoctrinated into us. What is indoctrinated? We take someone's doctrine and we place it into our minds. We need to get rid of these things. It's the only way we can free our minds. As Bob said, only ourselves can free our minds. And the true word has never been said. So perhaps, I'm reading it again, this perhaps is the potential power of such unity which forces those who profit from the status quo to feed the disunity among African people. One would hope that exposure of this plantation goes to the light of day, of knowledge, would facilitate its rapid disappearance. Africans now, as we did 300 years ago, still spend more time justifying our separate goals than we do of working for our shared goals. We are usually incapable of addressing our common problems because we feel that our separate problems are more important. This is another one of those constantly repeating dramas from slavery, which we continue to act out because we have not understood its origin in our not so distant slavery experience. So that was very important. You see how this unity is still in our community. It was fostered and put there. And as you know, the people who fear us most are the people who benefit the most. And who benefits the most from us? Everybody, from the top of society to the lower ranks of the society. So if we get together for ourselves, for our children, nothing will stop us. We must unify. This book lets us know what happened to us. We think, oh, because I train at work about work. I train first aid, fire safety, and things like that. And I speak to some youngsters, black people, and they'll say straight away, oh, black people, we can't get together. And they always come with a negative. We need to get that vocabulary away from our minds. Anytime somebody says up to you, black people can't, just shut them down straight away. Please, if you could do something for me and for yourself and for your family, for your community, anytime somebody comes with negativity, just shut them down. Don't even allow them to say it. So the next area here is family. Probably the most serious effect of all was the impact that slavery had on the African family. The family is the very foundation of healthy, constructive, and personal community life. Without a strong family, an individual life and community life are likely to become very unstable. The destruction or damage to the African family was accomplished by destroying marriage, fatherhood, and motherhood. And there's a quote here. Slavery does away with fathers, as it does away with families. Slavery has no use for either fathers or families, and its laws do not recognize their existence in the social arrangement of the plantation. When they do exist, they are not the outgrowths of slavery, but are the antagonistics to that, are antagonistic to that system. So if we think about it, people, of course I don't want to slap for father. Remember, the slave owner was a father. He was a mother. He was a judge, jury, and executioner. He had to be everything. We couldn't be nothing. And that's the way they ruled us. So when we see that certain black people today and the fathers not taking responsibilities, maybe the origin is from slavery, but we can't use those excuses. We cannot use excuses today. Yeah, it's ridiculous if you want to look back and say, oh, well, I'm not raising my kids because it's enslavement. That's rubbish. When you were lying down with a woman, were you thinking about you was enslaved? I don't think so. So the same way you can think about what you want to think about, same way you can think about you need to raise your children. William Goodall in 1853 describes the institution of marriage as it was viewed by the slaveholders. And there's another quote here. The slave has not rights, of course. He or she cannot have rights of a husband, a wife. The slave is a chattel, and chattels do not marry. The slave is not ranked among sentiments, beings, but among things, and things are not married. Quite simply. Chattel, do you understand this chattel? Come from the Old English. Chattel, cattle. We were effectively cattle to be bought and sold. We weren't people. Goodell continues with his graphic description of slave marriages. The obligations of a marriage are evidently inconsistent with the conditions of slavery and cannot be performed by the slave. The husband promises to protect his wife and provide for her. The wife promises to be the helpmeet of her husband. They mutually promise to live with and cherish each other until parted by death. But what can such promises by enslave mean? The legal relation of master and slave renders them void. It forbids the slave to protect even himself. It clothes his master with authority to bid him to inflict deadly blows on the woman he has sworn to protect. It prohibits his possession of any property wherewith to sustain her. It gives master unlimited control and full possession of her own person, and forbids her, on pain of death, to resist him. If he drags her to his bed, it severs the plighted pair at the will of their masters, occasionally and forever. So you can see, within the enslavement system, marriage, family, didn't exist. Maybe these are some of the things that are still in our psyche somewhere, but we have examples. My parents lived together for many, many years. I've got examples of what happened, yeah? Even though divorce happens, we still have the example of what a family unit is. But they had to destroy the African family unit. One thing about the enslaved people, when they escaped from the plantations, went up to the mountains, into the forests, into the hills, they created communities and villages on the African kind of prototype, where they come from, which they knew. So they had the families again. But on the plantation, no way, Jose, yeah? We're just there to be brutalized. So this description rather graphically illustrates the ultimate meaninglessness of marriage for the slaves. Even under circumstances where the marriage ties were not arbitrarily violated, the very conditions of slavery contradicted much about the vital and fundamental conditions of marriage. The African American man was evaluated by his ability to endure the strenuous work and to produce children. He was viewed by the slave master as a stud and a workhorse. The stronger and more children he could sire, the greater the expansion of the master's slave holdings, and the greater his financial worth. The more work the slave could perform, the greater the production. The greater were the profits that came to the master. African manhood was defined by his ability to impregnate a woman, and by the magnitude of his physical strength. The virtues of being able to protect, support, and provide for one's offspring, which is the cornerstone of true fatherhood, were not considered the mark of a man on the plantation. In fact, the enslaved who sought to assert such rights for his offspring was likely to be branded as a troublemaker and either punished or killed. And after several generations of such unnatural treatment, the African man adapted and began to resist the role of a true father. So you can see what they put into the African on the plantations. You could say the role of a father was beaten out of him. And these things are passed down over generation after generation. So the African coming out of enslavement, fatherhood wasn't something he did. Obviously, some of them, as you know, after enslavement, people went to look for their family, their wives, their children, their daughters, sisters. So we knew about family, and they searched for the family after enslavement. However, you could see for centuries and centuries that role was taken away from the Africans. Family and marriage was taken away from them. Today, in African communities around America, the Caribbean, we carry the mark of strong-armed stud from slavery. He occurs as the modern-day pimp, or the man who delights in leaving neglected babies dispersed around town. He is the man who feels that he is a man only by his physical, violent, or sexual exploits. He leaves welfare or chance to father his children, and he fathers his rides, his vines, or his chance, or his pad. Let me read that again. He leaves welfare or chance to father his children, and he fathers his ride, his car, or his vines, or his pad. So he's more interested in like his material things, yeah? The European culture, cars, and your house, not family. This peculiar behavior is often characterized as a racial trait attributable to some form of moral weakness in the African man. Such conclusions fail to identify the real origin of such characteristics. Such family responsibility does not occur among African people who have never been endured the ravages of slavery. or who were able to preserve their cultural integrity in spite of enslavement. The African woman was valued primarily as a breeder or sexual receptacle capable of having many healthy children. Again, Goodall, 1853, offers an example of a newspaper advertisement for an African woman which demonstrates the desirable qualities of the slave woman. So this makes it fact, because Europeans wrote this, yeah? A girl about 20 years of age, raised in Virginia, and her two female children, one 4 and the other 2 years old. See what they're selling? 2-year-old and 4-year-old. Is remarkably strong and healthy, never having had a day's sickness, with the exception of smallpox. In her life, the children are fine and healthy. She is very prolific in her generating qualities and affords a rare opportunity to any person who wishes to raise a family of healthy servants for their own use. So you can see how they advertise a woman like she's a horse. They can say her age, and she's good at generating qualities, who wish to raise a family of healthy servants. So you can see she was known for her womb and to be able to raise healthy children. Her work as a human being was reduced to the particular financial value or personal pleasure she could hold for the master. As a breeder, she was to be mated with the plantation's strongest studs, regardless of human attachment. She was also usually expected to be receptive to the sexual exploitation of the slave master, his relatives, or his friends. Again, another quote: forced concubinage of slave women with their masters and overseers, often coerced by the lashed, contributed to another class of facts, equally undesirable. Rape committed on the female slave is an offense not recognized by the law. So, unfortunately, the slave master and his people could do what they wanted to. They didn't have to worry about any law because, the lawmakers were the rapists themselves. Such abuses of African women began to damage the natural nurturing and dignity of motherhood. Children were conceived out of convenience for an oppressor, not even on the level of animal lust. The child was doomed to continue in the very conditions which had bred in him or her. Many women either became abusive to their children or overprotective of them in response to such inhuman conditions. Even today, we find too much frustrated young African women choosing to become breeders in search for identity. Too many of those young mothers become abusers of those children or turn them into spoiled or irresponsible pimps by their indulgently protecting them against a cruel world. The massive confusion around sexual identity is often addressed in African media and periodicals, has its foundations in the conditions of enslavement. Men seeking to be men through physical exploits, sexual exploits, or even violence is predictable in a setting where natural avenues of manhood have been systematically blocked. The woman who experiences inevitable frustration of their natural feminine aspirations when the paths to natural womanhood have been blocked. So you can see our roots to being who we're supposed to be, as just men and women, were blocked because the European had to have all control. The slave master had to have all control. So sometimes to be a man, we'll use violence. Yeah, show I'm a man. That's what we see someone used to do today to prove their manhood. Yeah, because maybe they don't own anything substantially, but they could be a man by being pregnant, by either using violence or by having children. Shows you how virile they are. But as you know, that's not real manhood. Historical images which we have inherited continue to sabotage many of our efforts for true manhood, fatherhood, and womanhood, and motherhood. In nature and throughout the historical development of cultural people, the roles of man and father, woman and mother have been inextricably bound. Only in the instances of a decaying culture, such as ancient Greece or Rome and modern Europe America has its bond been broken. With its breaks has come family dissolution, followed closely by the total societal dissolution. Although current attitudes and conditions, such as unemployment, feed these patterns and keep them growing, the origins of the African American family problems rest in the plague of slavery. If we understand the historical origin of these roles and patterns, then perhaps we will refuse to play them any longer. So that's very deep. I think you agree with me. You can see how certain things we may do, where the origins come from. We will say, why do people do that? Why do they act like that? Why could they say things like that? But 500 years. There's a Russian secret agent. He's worked for the Russian, the KGB. And they said when they went to a nation to indoctrinate the people, they said it took a generation. So, for example, if they wanted them to become a communist, they'll take the young children and teach them for a generation. And they said after a generation, they'll just continue it. This is the KGB agents. So if you think about when they brought Christianity to us, they said they take the young and teach the young, and after a generation, it'd be self-perpetuating. So sometimes we think, well, why are these Christians like that? Don't they know that Christianity was given to us during our enslavement? But if one generation has been indoctrinated to believe in Christianity, it becomes self-perpetuating. So this is Brother Jegna. This is the Afrocentricity Bookman Show. We are reading the great book by Naim Akbar. A book is very relevant to us today as when he wrote it over 30 years ago, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. So what we're going to do now, we're going to have a short break, and we'll be back on the other side. Have a nice break there. I'll be back with you in a little while.
Resistance is getting weaker. I just can't stand the pressure. My mind is getting weaker. I've got to find some other pleasure. I need nothing to be a man because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man. Such a state. Thank God I've got some life left. I'm getting of a sudden my soul stands aggressed. I mean nothing to be a man because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man. Misfortune is having me down. Sometimes it makes me sick. At times I try to hate, but I just don't know the trick. I need nothing to be a man because I was born a man, and I deserve the right to live like any other man.
There was good and evil. We chose good. Why raise the time of the Most High, ye sons of men? The rich man's wealth is in the city. is poverty, Lord. Destruction of your soul is vanity. Yeah, yeah. Do you hear? I wanna rule my destiny. Yeah, I wanna rule my destiny. Whoa, destiny. Mama, look from when you call me. Destiny. Mama, look from when you call it. I wanna rule my destiny. Yeah, yeah. Oh, help I please. Jaja, make me rule my destiny. Oh, we Lord, I've been blessed, I've been touched. I love Jah so much, they keep fighting me. I'm not giving up. May the realms of Zion fill my spiritual cup. Wisdom overstanding must never be too much. Give I protection day and night from even the pestilence that walk at that daylight. Destiny, Mama, look from when you calling. Destiny, Mama, look from when you calling. I wanna rule my destiny. Yeah, oh, help I please. Jaja, make me rule my destiny. Whoa, whoa, yeah. Cast away their cards most, Lord. You have them in the region, in the valley of decision. Restraining the Edens with a rod of iron. You know not the destiny of an next man, why hold him? Set him free for too long. I wanna rule my destiny. Oh yeah, I really wanna rule my destiny. Hear me call, call, call. Destiny, Mama, look from when you calling. Destiny, Mama, look from when you calling. I wanna rule my destiny. Oh, hey, help I please. I wanna rule my destiny. Where could I found? My destination is homeward bound. No forces try hold I down. Breaking chains has become the norm. I know I must get through, no matter what I want. Destiny, Mama, look from when you calling. Destiny, Mama, look from when you calling. Let me rule my destiny, Lord. And I tell you once more, the rich man's wealth is in the city. Oh, destruction of the poor is our poverty. Yeah, destruction of our soul is vanity. Oh, do you hear? Do you hear? Whoa, whoa, destiny, destiny.
Yes, greetings, Brother Jegan, back here again. We are continuing reading the Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery by Naim Akbar. Must remind you that this show is sponsored by Glass Are Us. You can go to Glass Are Us. They are at 730 Seven Sisters Road, N15 5NH. You can get Glass Are Us on 0208 800 6663. That is 0208 800 6663. Please go to Glass Us for all your glazing repairs, double glazings, shelving, table toss, splashbacks, mirrors, shower cubicles, balconies, any your glazing needs. Please go to Glass Us here, 0208 800 6663. And also, I must remind you that it's about 10 days ago now, with Afrocentricity International will be showing the great movie called The Birth of a Nation by Nate Parker. It is the story of Nat Turner Uprising and Rebellion, which happened in the USA. And it's being screened Wednesday, the 31st of July, 2019, 7 till 10 p.m. at the Ma'at Centre, 366A, High Road, Tottenham. That's London N17, 9HT. That's the Ma'at Centre, 366A, High Road, Tottenham, N17, 9HT. So that will be Nate Parker's Birth of a Nation. It's really a great movie. You should really come down there, bring your family down there. Just free refreshments, and there'll be a short discussion at the end. So that last tune there, Black Is My Color by Brown Sugar, a well-known classic, one of my favorite tunes there. And the next chapter, or the next subchapter of this book is actually called Color Discrimination. So we've seen that they divided us by communities, by those who live up the hill, those who work in the field, old, young and old, everything else. Also, they know, they use color, because as I said before, those nearest to the master's color, i.e. those with the precious blood in the veins, a lot more, was seen in a higher status than everybody else. And obviously those lower, more to the African side, more to maybe a full-blown African, unmixed African, was seen very lowly within this kind of sick society, in this kind of slave culture. So, slave discrimination. Certainly, there are a few irrational influences from slavery that have persisted as this one. Although the prevalence of this color discrimination has had periods of decline, it keeps returning in a more insidious form each generation. Skin color became the code for social position. Of course, those slaves who more closely resembled the slave master in color, the more positive the traits assigned to them. Excuse me. Of course, the very condition of the African slavery was determined on the basis of skin color. The failure of Caucasians and Native Americans to endure the physical abuse of involuntary servitude led to the more massive enslavement of the African. The contradiction that slavery presented was a supposedly free and Christian nation led to the justification of slavery as a divinely authorized action. So that's a joke, isn't it? USA is a free and Christian nation. Led to the justification of slavery as a divinely authorized slavery, i.e. God said they were allowed to do it. The African's black skin was considered as evidence of his cursed state to serve as a slave. Some misinterpreted biblical allegory. The curse of Ham was used to justify inhuman treatment of the African, who was wrongly assumed to be a descendant of Ham. Therefore, dark skin became equated with the reasons for slavery. The skin color of the slave became associated with other kinds of subhuman traits. On the other hand, the slave master's pale skin became equated with supernatural human traits. In fact, God, all the saints, and the entire heavenly host became identified with the pale skin. The logical conclusion of the abused, oppressed slave was that the basis for his condition was his skin color, and the way out of his condition was to change that color. This deeply ingrained idea persisted. Even today, there is an unnatural equation of Caucasians' physical features with beauty, intelligence, authority, and so forth. Many Africans continue to assume that beauty, competence, and worth are greater among their people with the most prominent Caucasian features. There are still vast sums of money spent every year on skin lighteners, hair straighteners, and wigs in the frantic effort to change African physical features. Good hair and nice features are still thought to be characteristics of most like Caucasians. Contrary to popular belief, these attitudes have not changed substantially among African youth, who have grown up since the Black Power movements of the 1960s, which is a very good point. Because a lot of young youth won't even know what the Black Power movement was. Who? Because they are taught by the children of the slave masters. So a slave master will never teach his enslaved to be free. It makes common sense because they want a slave. Their whole existence is built upon the enslavement. I'm sure you're all aware of the 13th Amendment. Slavery still continues in the USA. I'm sure you know that. Because when they freed Africans, they also put into the small print that slavery will never exist in the USA unless a person, and they knew exactly what I was writing, unless the person has committed a crime. So when they felt black people, oh, he didn't commit a crime. Well, they haven't done anything. They can re-enslave you. So in the USA today, I think there's something like they maybe earn maybe about 50 cents a day, 30 cents a day, who knows. But they're making the goods for some of the most major companies, like McDonald's, for example, or who makes those PCs. If you check the prison industrial complex and see who invests in it, what companies benefit by it, you'll be surprised by these companies. The major companies you can see are top on the stock market. You see advertising every day on TV and in newspapers and magazines. These are the companies who have people as slaves in prisons today because they invest in the prison industrial complex, which is for a profit, prison for profit. You know, there's more people in prison in the USA than there is anywhere else in the world. And there's more people in prison in the USA than they did have formerly enslaved people in the USA. And most of the people in prisons have melanin, black, and obviously the brown types as well. The following social movements of the 60s, another limb grew on the colour discrimination tree. There was an effort on the part of some people to equate African physical features with mental and moral superiority. The same confused mentality that established black as inferior and white as superior was evident in the effort to make black superior and white superior. So they're trying to flip on the head. We cannot deal with no black superiority. This is rubbish. But we are as great as we are. We've got more, we've got melanin, which other people don't have. And melanin is in every organ of our body. So as human beings go, we are pretty efficient human beings. The perspective, which limits the human makeup to its physical service of hue, is equally limited. Regardless of perspective, one scholar stated that he who remains ignorant of history is doomed to repeat history. And it's very true. Repeat the mistakes of history, I think it would be better said. Certainly the persistence of our psychological, social and economic dependence on our former slaveholders is evidence of the validity of this adage. I.e., we're not learning the mistakes of our past. The intensity and brutality of the slave-making experience traumatized our social and human development. The intensity and brutality of the slave-making experience traumatized our social and human development. Though many writers have spoken of slavery, few scholars have addressed the continuity of the behaviors established in slavery as a continuing aspect of African psychology. One exception is probably Stanley Elkins in 1968, who developed a sociological thesis that argued that the closed nature of North American slavery was in contrast to Latin American slavery, produced a, in speech marks, Sambo type personality in the slave. The Sambo was described by Elkins as docile but irresponsible, loyal but lazy, humble but chronically given to lying and stealing, This behavior was full of infantile silliness, and his talk inflated with childish exaggeration. His relationship with his master was one of utter dependence and childlike attachment. The problem with Elkin's analysis of the black personality while identifying a possible outcome of slavery is that he consumed his analysis into a single image. Our suggestion is of much greater complexity, but a similar recognition that the slavery situation produced some persisting personality traits. The reader might inquire with considerable basis that if this discussion is correct, then the African American personality has been devastated. One would expect the obvious taint of this humanely demoralizing experience to have affected all aspects and all members of this community. In fact, the vast majority of African Americans operate with considerable efficiency and are generally no more severely disordered than are the peoples who are historically the perpetrators rather than the victims of these conditions. The fact that despite slavery, such effective functioning is the rule speaks to two factors which space will not permit adequate development and discussion. The first factor is the apparent strength and character and culture and heritage that African people apparently brought to America's plantations. Other people have degenerated in their fundamental humanity under conditions of stress far less intense and enduring than those experienced by African people. Research needs to identify the elements that the African character which might serve as a model for human strength in general. The second factor is that survival of the fundamental human initiative among African Americans, despite 300 years of the most inhuman conditions ever experienced by any people in the current historical epoch, is indicative of human resilience at its best. Despite the lingering vestiges which I've described in this discussion, recovery has been substantial. The triumph of America's former slaves far exceed the deficits attributed to us. African American people exist more as a monument of human accomplishment than remains of human destruction. So I agree with that totally. If you understand what happened to us for over 3 and 4 centuries, what has come out at the other end of that 300-year, 400-year period, obviously there's issues, and we've been through the issues in this book here, some of the issues we have, inferiority and things like that. However, what we accomplished is incredible. Do you know what happened to us? Do you know how we was treated? 400 years. And then after the 400 years, we're still being treated similarly, even though we've been given, oh, you are free now, we're still being treated. They ensure that all African nations are impoverished, no matter where they are, in the Caribbean, in Africa. They ensure they are impoverished. You must not have the idea of money. I'm not sure if you're familiar with King Leopold's letter. He wrote a letter to all his priests going to bring Christianity to Africa. And in the letter, he specifically says you must keep them poor. He says, don't let them think about wealth. Why would they do that? Napoleon said the same thing. But he went further. He said, I'm not really fighting the black to keep him poor, but it's to stop his growth completely, to stop him in history. No, racist Napoleon, we just want to stop black people at all. So there is a feel that they will keep people impoverished. If you remember David Cameron, when he's still Prime Minister, he went to Jamaica. And rather than said to Jamaica, well, let me help you with education or business or something like that, he said, no, I'll give you money if you want to build more prisons. So he doesn't care about the poverty was in Jamaica, but I'll give you prisons. So he's then basically saying that, well, but you've got criminals there. So you see what he says, and what we just read in his book, criminal-like. They see our culture or our demeanour as being criminal. They don't see us as creators, and they don't see us as being rich either. But he wants to give Jamaicans money for build prisons. So you can see these people don't change from century to century, decade to decade. These people are still exactly the same people. So, however, the fact remains, the plantation ghost still haunts us. Our progress is still impeded by many of the slavery-based characteristics which we have described previously. The objective of the discussion is not to cry victim and seek to excuse self-destructive characteristics created by slavery. In fact, the objective is to identify the magnitude of the slavery trauma and to suggest persistence of a post-slavery traumatic stress syndrome, which still affects the African American personality and African personality generally. It is not a call to vindicate the cause of the condition, but to challenge black people to recognize the symptoms of the condition and master it as we have mastered the original trauma. So what's he saying there? He's not saying we're highlighting this, the reason why we are is because of this. He's saying we highlight it so we can fight it, we can reverse it, so it help us to move forward. That's the only thing. We don't read for the sake of reading. We're reading here for the sake of using information to reconstruct our psyche, our culture. These things have been damaged over 4 or 5 centuries deliberately. Because they know when you destroy people's culture, they'll adopt any other culture. Yeah, that's why we have adopted certain traits from non-African people. Not saying we can never do this, but we must have our own traits first and foremost. And if we can see traits that we don't have, which are positive traits, maybe we can adopt some of them. But like everybody else, we must have our own traits. Neither in this discussion is an effort to underestimate the severity and barbarity of the continued economic and social exploitation of America's former slaves. It is to call our attention to the array of attitudes, habits, and behaviors which clearly follow a direct line to slavery. It is hoped that by shining the lights of awareness on these dark recesses of our past, we can begin to conquer the ghosts which continue to haunt our personal and social lives. We can begin to move beyond the shackles of restricting human growth that have bound us since the kidnapping of not so long ago. So this is Brother Jegna with the Afrocentricity Book Show. Remember, every Sunday between 4 to 6 p.m. on Bless Radio. We are reading Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery by Naim Akbar. This helps us to understand what happened to us and some of the negative attitudes and behaviors that we may still cover or still carry within our psyches and within our communities. The only way we can destroy these things is by confronting it. When I was speaking to one sister about this type of thing, and she sort of said, no, it's about time we forgot about it. But if we run away from it, we're going to continue with the same negative behaviors. It's only when we understand what happened to us is the only time we can confront it to reverse it. If we don't know what happened to us, how can we change it? If you're sick, can a doctor fix you if he doesn't know what the illness is? The doctor will just remember take your medical history, he'll go back as far as he can. He won't just say, I've got a headache today, and he give you something for your headache today. He'll want to go back to find out what happened to you. So that'll be the best treatment that can be given. We need to go back as well so we can see what happened to us, so we can give ourselves the best treatment. In the next section, we shall look at the process of breaking the chains of slavery. We must understand that despite the impact of the slavery experience and the persistence of many of these characteristics, slavery behaviors, Africans and other victims of this kind of oppression are not passive objects of their own historical trauma. So this chapter now is called Liberation from Mental Slavery. And I should be good if I could drop Bob Marley's tune here now. It would be a nice intro, but okay. Let me continue. In order to address the problems of breaking the chains of mental slavery, there is a simple but important idea that must be understood. This idea is actually true for all human beings, but has special importance for the people in their current conditions of black people. This idea is that human beings are a very special form of creation. We have a very unique place in nature. We are the only life form in nature who operate based on self-consciousness. Very interesting. Every other animal form of life on this planet, no matter how gigantic or small, I lost my page there. Every other form of life force on this planet, no matter how gigantic or small, whether it has the building precision of a termite or the destructive capacity of a rhinoceros, do what they do not based on what they know about themselves, but guided by their instinct or innate programming. There is nothing which requires a worker bee to define itself as a worker bee in order to work in a hive. Insects, birds, and beasts do what they do based on instincts or training, adaptation. None of them inquire their abilities from any knowledge of who they are, at least as far as we have been able to observe. This quality of creatures in nature has some drawbacks. On the one hand, these creatures are able to do what they do, and not so much more other than what they are programmed to do. Ants have been building the same basic type of hills for thousands of years, with occasional modifications to fit the changes which humanity has imposed on nature. They have not been able to progress beyond this form, and they will probably be doing it the same way for thousands of years to come. Even though the form apparently serves them well, there is no evidence of any significant advancement in their hill building skills over the centuries. We have no evidence that other forms of life on the planet has a capacity to make anything known as progress, because they are locked into what they do very well, and they can't do too much else. As human beings, our limitations rest only on our ignorance. We are ignorant of who we are and what we do. We must have the need to gain consciousness, awareness, and only in consciousness of our true human capacity open to us. We are not a tabula rasa, which is a blank slate, at the time of birth, but we must have the access to code, must have the access code in order to gain creativity from our God-given genius. The access code for other animals, life forms, is simply the stimulation of the environment and some minor training experiences. We must acquire consciousness of who we are and what we have been in order to operate to our full human capacity. This is why cultures expend so much energy in creating a kind of environments and experiences which ensure that each generation of human beings will maintain the gains and acquire the consciousness which is necessary to preserve human accomplishments. Human beings clearly have the deadly potential to drop below even the most despicable forms of barbarism and endanger the entirety of the human advancement. But even the most basic human characteristics. We are the only life form who can engage in collective and individual self-murder for no apparent transcendent motive, while knowing the consequences of the suicidal act. Excuse me 1 minute. Excuse me, I just had to clear my throat. So the rare occurrence of other animals committing suicide, such as whales beaching themselves, is undoubtedly a result of ecologically insensitive humans disrupting the natural environment, which fouls up the natural instincts, rather than the behaviours being a self-conscious self-murder. We can go lower than any form of life, but we also can go higher. And this is the mixed blessing of freedom. If this is the nature of a mixed blessing of freedom, what must we identify as a source of human power? The answer is obvious. As we have suggested above, the ultimate human power is our mental power, our consciousness, our awareness. Whatever the form that consciousness will take will determine our state and circumstances as human beings. So he's saying there, what we have, which all other animals or living beings do not have, is consciousness. It's our consciousness who does everything for us, really. Yeah, our awareness of the environment, awareness of who we are. By no means is this an original formulation. This perception is as old as there has been any remnant of human civilization. This has been known as by Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is a knowing being, by the way. For as long as we have been Homo sapiens, human beings have consistently worked to create the circumstances to maximize their consciousness and to ensure that each subsequent generation will know fully who and what they are. On the other hand, whenever human beings choose to oppress or capture other human beings, they also did all that they could do to undermine any expansion of consciousness while they are oppressed. So when a group who has power wants to maintain that power, or he wants to take over the power of others, when people want to make captives of other people, they operate with the very same assumptions. They understand that ultimately the control of people was the control of their thinking, in their control of their minds, in control of their consciousness. So hope you can all understand that. The fact that they control people's consciousnesses so they can control the people. The process of enslavement was not simply the brute force of overcoming people who were militarily weaker and forcing them to operate under your influence. It was not simply the outcome of barbaric treatment of captives by assault, brutality, restricted movement and activity. The process of human slavery ultimately is a psychological process by which the minds of people is gradually brought under control by their captors, and they become imprisoned by the loss of their consciousness, awareness of themselves. It is this process which completely altered the human conduct of African people in the last 4 centuries. So it's very important. The reason what the Europeans did to us during our enslavement and through our colonization was to change our consciousness, because they knew that when you change their consciousness, you change the way they think. In fact, you can dominate the way they think. So it's this process which completely altered the human conduct of African people over the last 4 centuries. The disruption of our consciousness building processes and the imposition of an alien consciousness has reduced Africans from being major builders and contributors to world civilization to becoming totally dependent on other civilizations for any guide of human conduct. So do we agree with that? Why haven't Africans put their own satellite into space so that maybe we can have our own TV channels? Why haven't Africans gone to the moon? There's enough wealth in Africa to build anything, but our consciousness has been changed. Maybe we can't believe. How many cars do we create? I know in Ghana they're creating their cars there, but why haven't we got our fleets of cars? Why haven't we got our Suzukis and Yamahas? TVs. So you can see what has happened to us has really messed us up psychologically. It's kind of altered I think the best way would be probably my greatest psychologist, Amos Wilson. One of his books is called The Falsification of African Consciousness. Our consciousness has been falsified. We don't know who we are. We think we're dependent. You see Africans going to Europeans for seeds to grow things. We are the first agriculturalists. How are we going to other people to ask them how we grow and cease to grow? So our consciousness has been falsified by our enemies, who are laughing now because they're still earning so much money from us. So the disruption of our conscious building processes and the imposition of an alien consciousness has reduced Africans from being major builders and contributors to world civilization to becoming totally dependent on other civilizations for any guide of human conduct. Africans are most notorious for their self-destructive conduct, sometimes, which is indicative of the processes of a destroyed consciousness that we are describing here. In the USA, for example, in Chicago in particular, you know it's social engineering. They flood the neighborhood with guns. The African Americans there said, we don't even know where these guns are coming from. We've got so many guns in there. Why did they flood the neighborhood with guns? Do you remember that film by the director that passed away very recently? And he said, Larry Fishburne was acting, and he had his son, And they said, when he speaks to them, he says that they want us to kill each other. What it is, they take education out of the community and flood the neighborhood with alcohol and guns. And he said, because they want us to kill ourselves. Boys in the hood. Boys in the hood. Yeah, the character played by Larry Fishburne, he says they want us to kill ourselves. They flood the neighborhood with guns and alcohol and take our education and jobs. So what do you think these people are going to do? And when you watch Hollywood, if you watch 100 films of Hollywood, 99 of them, probably 90, but at least 99, the black people are criminals. Or they can play ball, or they can be a drug dealer. Or they can play ball, or be a killer. So it shapes our minds. Again, the falsification of our consciousness is an ongoing experiment by these people. And you know it's deliberate. He said it happened in slavery, but it's ongoing. What do you see? What are the images you see of the African, male or female on TV? I think I'll let you mull on that one. The case of the history of African Americans is a dramatic illustration of how this process destroys the human power. Africans were the builders of pyramids. Now we destroy our own homes in frustrated explosions of rage and irresponsibility. We reach high civilizations through the dignified leadership of African queens. And many of us have now become contemporary abusers of black femininity. We introduce medicines and healing onto the planet. Now we will become drug pushers and destroyers of our own lives. We have descended from the scientists who studied the heavens to become clowns who degrade and brutalize ourselves for the entertainment of our captors. These processes could only occur as a result of a loss of our higher human awareness. So I hope you all listen to this book. This is how powerful this book is. It says, how can the people who brought medicine to the world now end up being drug dealers? Standing on the street corner. How can the people who brought the most first humane and peaceful societies now be the people who want to kill each other on a regular basis? I just said in Chicago, the amount of killing there is just crazy. Day after day after day, little children are caught in the crossfire. It's crazy. But it still was deliberate. They want to destroy each other. It's not new. This is well known. So until we understand these things, until we understand that our consciousness has been falsified, has been destroyed, skewed, beaten on, trodden on, smashed to the ground, we're going to continue at the same way. We just need to understand who we are. That's why Sankofa is good. What's Sankofa? It's a concept from the Akan people of West Africa that sometimes you must go back to the past to learn what you did before so you can move forward. There's nothing taboo, there's nothing wrong with going back to learn from the past so you can move forward. When you come up with a problem now, what shall I do? Go back to the past. We are the oldest people on this planet. There's chances are there's very little that we have not done previously. Go back and learn from the past so you can move forward. If we don't learn from the past, we will only repeat the mistakes. So, let us make slaves. How did the slave makers accomplish this first deadly feat? They engaged in a systematic process of dismantling any and all of the mechanisms that preserve the continuity of African people. The African captives were separated from related language groups and were isolated from their most familiar selves. Any of the rituals that preserve the integrity of the African culture, from marriages to funerals, were forbidden, and alien practices were substituted, or none were permitted at all. They cut the tongues from the griots, that's our oral historians, from the griots who tried in their quiet night to remind the people that there was a continuity that reached beyond the fields, which they had come to know in Jamaica, Bahia, Alabama, Georgia, and Virginia. Griots tried to remind the people of difficult days which had already passed, and how we endured death from the environment and from the hands of our enemies for centuries past. They tried to keep the people reminded that there was hope even in the face of hopelessness. This story was stopped and the teller was called a troublemaker and used an example of the fate of those dear to sustain the captive story of salvation. Such storytellers were brutally killed or mutilated so that their story of African continuity was not told. So when we had historians, again, they stopped that. So let me remind you, this is Brother Jegna. This is the Afrocentricity Bookman Show. We are reading Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery by Naim Akbar. Slave owners frequently snatched suckling infants from their mother's breast for fear that the natural empathy of the birth mother might communicate a message of resistance that would undermine their process of captivity. There was a kind of conspiracy to create a race of orphans to intentionally break down the black family. It is so ironical that the contemporary social scientists make such an issue of the breakdown of the black family, which did not begin to break down until some white families began to break it down for their own objectives. As we discussed in the previous section, families were broken up at the whim of a slave master. In addition, black men were forced to watch their wives, daughters, sisters, and mothers raped by their owners. Such experiences effectively disrupted the sense of connection and reciprocal experiences or protection that exists in the preservation of family systems. By undermining this loyalty and protective image for almost 20 generations, 400 years, as one is able to create a painful alienation between men and women, which continues to contaminate the reciprocal respect that men and women must have for each other in order to develop and maintain families. You see, I've got nothing against black men and white women, if that's what they want to go for. But if all black men go out with all white women, there'll be no more black community. So why do we go for non-black women in high numbers? It's all linked to what I'm reading to you now. It's all linked from our most recent past, recent centuries, what is happening to our minds. Because if we hate ourselves, we think we're ugly, we're going to go away and look for something else which takes us away from that ugliness. As we have discussed in earlier parts of this volume, the personal character of the former slaves was distorted in ways that even 130 years from legal emancipation we still carry the scars. Let me read that again. As we have discussed earlier in parts of this volume, the personal character of the former slaves was distorted in ways that even 130 years from legal emancipation we still carry the scars. The processes of brutality, humiliation, and deliberate ignorance continue to plague the personalities of Africa's former slaves in such ways that make us our major enemies here at the turn of the century. The psychological processes of slave making remain an inadequately understood and appreciated phenomena for its impact on the functioning of African American persons and our communities. The challenge for those who would choose to be healers of the black life must be the removal of these psychological chains. And that's what healers does, yeah? Healers heal their people. Strategies for breaking the chains of slavery. So we're coming up to the last few, short while, so we continue. It is important to understand that as a primary rule that the restoration of African consciousness is a process that must be accomplished primarily by African people. We cannot rely on anybody else to do it for us. It is unrealistic to expect descendants of the slave masters will initiate and play a major role in the elimination of the mental shackles which were put in place by their ancestors. This is not a condemnation of European people, as was the case with the abolition of the physical slavery. Many white people played a critical roles which facilitated the alleviation of some of the philosophical contradictions of legalized slavery in a free country. That's free in speech marks. However, it was the impetus and the persistence of the former slaves themselves which took the radical posture to demand and compromise the elimination of the system of slavery. We are again reminded of the tension experienced between Frederick Douglass, who was an escaped slave, and liberal white abolitionist friends who viewed many of his positions as being too extreme. See, these people always hold us back. Certainly Nat Turner had no white allies in his forceful removal of the captor's boot from his neck. So much of the European consciousness is based upon its affirmation of greatness and superiority, in contrast to the inferiority and wretchedness of the African. This false security built upon white supremacist culture clearly limits the role of European, This false security built upon white supremacist culture clearly limits the role that Europeans are capable of understanding or playing in the restoration of African consciousness. Whether whites play a role or not is not nearly as important as it is for the black people to understand that our ultimate mental liberation must be guided by our independent action and activity. We cannot operate with expectations that our true liberation can only come from Europeans. European people changed, we're expecting European people to change their mentality. Not going to happen. The elimination of white racism is not necessary. It's not necessarily a prerequisite for the liberation of the African mind. Let me repeat that. The elimination of white racism is not necessary. It's not a necessary prerequisite for the liberation of the African mind. If we are waiting for white people to get rid of racism before we free African mind, our mind will always be enslaved. Our prerequisite is to free our African mind, people. Black people cannot commit excessive energy to the effort to alter the attitudes and consciousness of white people with the assumption that this is the path for freedom. Certainly, the obstacles created by white supremacist institutions and attitudes cause great difficulties to the march of black mental liberation. There is no doubt that if those obstacles were removed, progress would be much easier. It is evident that after all these centuries that are unrealistic, it is unrealistic to expect European white supremacist mentality that is going to disappear anytime soon. White racism is a fact of life, and we must strategize solutions which are independent of its initial elimination. As we have discussed above, the primary objective to freeing the black mind is to change the consciousness of black people. This is not a simple nor a brief process. We must understand that the current consciousness of black people is the consequence of over 400 centuries of direct intervention and even longer efforts to destroy the indigenous institutions of African people, which developed and sustained their independent human consciousness. So it's very important there, guys, that they destroyed our institutions in Africa. So, because these institutions are what kept our African consciousness intact. When they destroyed our African institution, it was to destroy our African consciousness. I hope it makes sense to everybody. So whether it's enslavement or colonization, as soon as they came to Africa to colonize us, as soon as they had the power to, they destroyed our institutions. Remember, our institutions contain our culture. You destroy institutions, you destroy our culture. And ultimately, our African consciousness of who we are, what we are, where we've been, where we're going. We cannot expect this process will be reversed at the end of the day or by reading the book. Once we embark upon the journey, change has already begun and will continue so long as the direction is maintained. We dare not surrender and declare defeat. If we don't immediately see the massive results that we would wish, we must understand that generations of unborn African people will be the true beneficiaries of this process. So we're winding up now. So I'd say to people as well, the freedom we are fighting for, we may not see it ourselves, but it's for our children to see it. It's for our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. This is why we must continue to fight. I'm not talking about to fight to use violence, although we must defend ourselves, but what we should really fight on is to lay the foundations in place so we can do what needs to do. We need our own institutions, life-giving, life-protecting African institutions, which will strengthen our African consciousness so we can move forward to do what we need to do. We cannot rely on anybody to do it for us. Only we can set ourselves free. As I say every week, what we think of ourselves depends on what we know about ourselves. And what we know about ourselves depends on what we are taught about ourselves. And when we've been taught by others, you know what we've been taught about ourselves? Our inferiority, as the book has just explained. So that's why we got this show now, so we can read our books, we can go through and speak amongst ourselves. These recordings will be on YouTube, so you must send them to your friends, let your people know about these books. You must really start book clubs. I know some people do book clubs. They get a book, they'll arrange a number of their friends, and they'll sit down and discuss books. This is the only way we're going to get knowledge, people. We need to turn that TV off. The TV is just full of rubbish. We need to turn the TV off, turn on the radio on to shows like this, which talk truth, yeah? Turn off the social media. Foolishness we'll look at. Foolishness what keeps us more enslaved. We need to regain our African consciousness. How can we gain our African consciousness? By understanding who we are, by freeing our mind from all the verbiage which was being put on our mind over these 5, even 6 centuries coming up now. So we know as African people, our past will let us know who we are. I think as the quote from John Henry Clark, our history is a clock which tells our political time of day. It tells where we have been, it tells us where we are, but more importantly, it tells us where we still must go. So we have to understand that only by reading, by studying, by speaking to people, that we'll get to where we need to get to, but only when we recover our African consciousness. At the moment, there is a battle for the African mind. We are winning. We are moving on. With the social media, there's so much social media now, we are teaching each other things. However, sadly, our leaders, many of them are still controlled by our former enemies. So we have to be the leaders. We have to be the leaders ourselves. We need to educate each other. So we will demand from our leaders what we need. At the moment, when we look to be a leader, we look at the leader, we want to maybe drive a nice Mercedes, live in a nice house. We're not Europeans. We can't deal with materialism. It's no problem. We want to have a nice house, but civilization is about being civil to each other, protecting each other, looking after each other. Civilization is not about having a big house and a nice suit to wear, the latest leather sofa, yeah? That's foolishness. That's not African culture. European culture is about materialism, individuality. That's completely different, yeah? Remember, we are people from the Southern Cradle. Southern Cradle is about unity. I'm sure you're all familiar with Ubuntu, the concept will come from Southern Africa. I think it's from the Zulu people. I am because we are. And because we are, I am. Which means that even though you may be an individual yourself, you don't make sense outside of your group, outside of your people. Your people make you who you are, and you collectively make your people. But Europeanisms is about individuality. Get your own car, get your own big house, don't care about anybody else. We cannot live like that. We must remember we are African people. We are the oldest people on the planet, so it's important we go back to our own culture. Okay? Good. So this is Afrocentricity Book Show. Please have a great week. I will be back again next week, and we'll be continuing the book, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. So please have a great week, people, and I will see you next time.
You just gonna set it up. I was just waiting for those horns. Should be coming soon, right? What you feeling down for? No, I like that. Just vibing right now. Don't be sad. The sun is shining. The angels are dancing in heaven. You hear me?
Wake up, people, wake up.
Wake up, people, wake up now. Wake up. Wake up, people, wake up. Wake up. Wake up the people, Lord, wake up. Listen. Father God, in your name I pray. Help the people.